Hey folks, this weekend there is a Historic Set Championship Qualifier weekend event, and I wanted to make a video to help prepare you for it. Originally I was considering making this into a tier list, but to be honest, Historic is in sort of a weird spot because there are a lot of decks that are moderately popular, but a couple of factors make it so that I don't think a tier list is the appropriate type of way to describe the metagame. And the most significant part of that is that the Historic Set Championship Qualifier this weekend has a lot of folks who qualified playing formats that aren't Historic, and Historic has changed a lot recently, which tends to mean that there are going to be more people playing kind of just older, not super meta decks that are just more comfortable for them, and there are going to be a lot of people who kind of aren't caught up with the metagame because it's changed a lot rapidly recently. All of that to say that because knowing what decks folks are going to play informs a lot about which decks are high tier decks and low tier decks, it's not really super easy to say, like, this is the best deck in the metagame right now. So with all of that said, there are a couple of decks that are on this list and are more tier 1-ish than others. The big ones that I think you want to have on your mind and that you want to plan your deck to beat and try not to have a bad matchup against, if at all possible. Blue-White Control, Blue-White Lotus Field, Jeskai Control, Izzet Phoenix, Heliod Company, Niv Mizzet, Enchantress, Jeskai Creativity, and especially Blue-White Auras. Those are the decks that I think have the best ratio of matchups against the other decks on this list, and are the most poised to be the kind of decks you want to play against. Or want to be prepared to play against, rather. So, with that said, we're going to go into every archetype on this list. We're going to talk about the key cards that are in them. We're going to talk about important interactions you should know. And we're going to try to get you totally crash course caught up to the Historic meta as fast as possible. Oh, and additionally, before we jump into this, all of these lists of key cards are going to be in the description of the video. So if you want to import them and familiarize yourself with the cards that are pretty common to each of these archetypes, then go ahead and give the description a look at. So to give a quick reminder, the way that we're going to be breaking down these key cards is not really focusing on the idea of 60-card deck lists. The exact deck lists vary, everybody's going to be playing something different, and the core takeaway to get this done as quickly as possible is that we're more concerned about what decks are capable of doing and what cards might be in them and are common, more so than are they going to be playing 3 copies of Portable Hole or 4. So with that said, starting away with Blue-White Control, it's important to note that there are 2 very different builds of Blue-White Control right now, one of which, the one in front of us, is going to be a little more traditional, the other being the Lotus Field Stifle deck. An important part of about playing against them is that you want to identify which you're playing against. The first version that isn't playing Lotus Field, isn't playing Stifles, isn't playing Tails End, isn't playing Strict Proctor, is a lot closer to what a more traditional control list that Jeskai Control is accustomed to us to looks like. And its main takeaways are that it got Divine Purge recently, which is a pretty potent 3-mana Wrath that slows down aggressive decks quite a bit, while also actually being relatively useful against the Trail of Crumbs decks. It hits food tokens, it hits Cauldron Familiars, and it hits Witch's Oven, all of which it takes a long time to replay. That does mean, though, that versions that play Divine Purge tend not to play Portable Hole, because Divine Purge does exile artifacts, including Portable Hole, which you don't really want to play a removal spell early and then Divine Purge to answer your own removal spell from earlier. So some versions play Portable Hole, some versions play Divine Purge. Very few play both. But otherwise, a very familiar control deck usually tends to lean heavier on Declaration in Stone and Fateful Absence, lacking the removal spells that tend to be better against aggressive decks. The niche in the metagame for these decks right now is that they tend to be control decks that are good against other control decks. They tend to have lots of counter spells, lots of instant speed threats, and try to be lean in a way that's effective against the Lotus Field decks and the Jeskai decks in the metagame. They tend to be weaker against other aggressive decks, and especially compared to Jeskai, that tends to be their weakness. So if you're playing a Gruul deck, this is probably the version you're going to want to be playing against. But as to where they wind up in the metagame, that's probably going to depend a lot on how successful that aggro decks are against the other versions of control. The Lotus Field versions of Blue-White, on the other hand, might be a little less familiar if you haven't been playing Historic recently. Lotus Field being a hexproof land that taps for 3 mana of any colors, with the downside of when it enters the battlefield you have to sacrifice 2 lands, so it doesn't actually end up netting mana. This deck aims to avoid that by playing Stifle, Tail's End, and Discontinuity on their own turn to essentially remove the Lotus Field trigger while it's on the stack. They also play Strict Proctor that shuts off the ETB effect of Lotus Field. Historically, this deck has been better against aggro when Strict Proctor is actively shutting off various different aggressive synergies. And as a result, a lot of aggressive decks have moved away from the green-black cat oven style of deck that really needs its ETBs to function, and have started moving more towards Gruul-based aggro or mono-black-based aggro that just play more traditionally highly statted creatures that attack, with one of the weaknesses of this deck being that it kind of can't play Portable Hole too often because Strict Proctor and Divine Purge both don't synergize with it. It does get to play Fateful Absence and Declaration in Stone that gives it some amount of instant speed, 2-mana interaction, but it fills a lot of its space with ways to counter the Lotus Field trigger instead of early interaction. So in the games where it doesn't find a way to get the Lotus Field out very quickly and start doing things like playing Wrath of Gods and Narsets in the same turn, it can tend to fall behind in ways that other control decks with lower curves try not to. But once the Lotus Field is online, especially in mirror matchups, it gets to go really hard with a lot more copies of Memory Deluge than other decks are playing. But those same control mirrors, it's very vulnerable to having Stifles and Tails Ends on Lotus Field triggers countered, and then potentially falling pretty far behind on mana. But when that doesn't happen, it definitely gets to make up for it. Jeskai Control tends to be pretty similar to the Blue-White lists, with the previously mentioned difference of Lightning Helix and Unholy Heat being removal spells that are a lot more effective against some of the low-to-ground linear aggressive lists, and Anger of the Gods being a much better removal spell against Phoenix lists. The downside generally being that compared to traditional Blue-White control, they tend to have slightly less card advantage, with the exception of Expressive Iteration that is a pretty big difference, but generally fewer Memory Deluge and Narsets. They also tend to have less room for Shark Typhoons and counterspells post-board, but try to make up for that with better game against aggro. It is worth noting that right now there are 2 pretty different builds of Jeskai Control that tend to orient around either a Magma Opus package or no Magma Opus package at all. The versions with Magma Opus tend not to run the card advantage like Memory Deluge and tend to run a little less in the way of sweeper removal, and try to get an advantage against the aggressive decks by turboing out Magma Opus into Mizzet's Mastery or Magma Opus into Torrential Gearhulk to invalidate medium-sized creatures a little faster. The versions that aren't running that tend to do so because it's not as good against the main deck Graveyard Hate that's becoming a lot more popular in nearly every deck in the metagame, and also because it's a lot of cards that are really bad in the Phoenix matchup that can be hard to find room to sideboard out. It's just not very profitable to play sorcery speed removal spells against Phoenixes that come back with haste, or a bunch of very expensive creatures that don't block flyers at all. Izzet Phoenix is probably a more familiar list for folks who haven't been playing Historic recently. It's still doing mostly the same thing. The biggest difference compared to where it was at previously is that it plays Dragon's Rage Channeler, which allows it to turbo stuff into the graveyard quite a bit faster than before, and sets up Delirium for Unholy Heat really quickly. But in general, the deck is all about getting as many cards into the graveyard as fast as possible, and then trying to cast 3 spells in a turn to get back Arclight Phoenixes, and with the expectation with pretty much every deck in the metagame right now has a plan to attack the graveyard post-board, if not main board. They also tend to play Crackling Drakes as the most common method to kind of swerve graveyard hate. So if you're planning to have a game plan against Phoenix that attacks the graveyard, make sure to keep in mind that Crackling Drake is the usual follow-up that they fall back to. In addition to that, it usually tries to run Sprite Dragons, Expressive Iterations, Ox of Agonis, and Stormwing Entity as ways to try to fall back when the Arclight Phoenix, Dragon's Rage Channeler aggressive game plan doesn't work, and tries to answer various different graveyard hate permanents with Petty Theft. Golgari Food is a relatively more recent version of Jund Food, whose niche in the metagame is pretty much entirely related to destroying creature decks. It plays a lot of Meathook Massacres, a lot of Witches' Ovens, a lot of Gilded Gooses, Cauldron Familiars, and Ravenous Squirrels in particular, to try to take advantage of all sorts of different sacrifice synergies to grow some truly monstrous squirrels and drain their opponents for a lot. And in doing so, turn on Fatal Push and Bone Shards really reliably, along with Trail of Crumbs providing card advantage, with Deadly Dispute feeling the backup for that role. What they don't do as stellarly is handle all of the control decks. They tend not to have a huge number of threats, which means if Squirrels and Witches' Ovens get answered, they can have a card advantage fallback plan with Trail of Crumbs, but it's not where they're happiest to be. There's a kind of finite number of actual threats they can play in a typical game. So, although it's a newer deck, it's kind of been falling off with the advent of blue-white control decks. But if you're planning to play a creature deck, this is one of the things you should have on your radar as a deck you're going to want to have a plan against, especially in terms of how you're going to answer the massive amounts of removal and life gain that it represents. Heliod Company, together with the Indomitable Creativity decks that we're going to talk about a little later, are the 2 major combo decks in the format that kind of restrict every other deck, in the sense of every deck that people play needs to have a functional plan for how it handles the combo element these decks present. In the Heliod deck's case, that is combining Scurry Oak and Heliod Suncrowned with any effect that creates a life gain trigger when a creature enters the battlefield, of which it plays many. Soul Warden, Lunark Veteran, Ajani's Welcome, and Prosperous Innkeeper being the most common ones. The way the combo works is whenever you gain life, Heliod puts a counter on something. Whenever Scurry Oak gets a counter put on it, it makes a squirrel, and then whenever a squirrel gets made, you gain life. Every piece of the combo is fetchable with Collected Company and Inquisitor Captain, which allows the deck to present a lot of different instant speed ways to start making a lot of creatures all at once, and in the meantime gain infinite life. Creature decks especially have a really tough time with this combo, because If the goal is to be aggressive, then you're not answering their creatures, and they make a lot of chump blockers and gain a lot of life, so you're going to have a hard time actually killing them before they assemble their combo rather reliably, unless you have a plan to either play enough removal that you can keep them off of one part of that combo, usually Scurry Oak. It's the least replaceable part, aside from Heliod, who is kind of indestructible and hard to answer as a result. Or by attacking their ability to gain life at all with things like Rampaging Ferocidon. Worth noting, the deck does have a pretty reliable aggro backup plan that is mostly centered around Voice of the Blessed, Trelisara, and Heliod Suncrown as ways to get very large creatures very quickly, combining mostly just a bunch of tiny 1-drops that gain a bunch of life, but don't amount to much on their own. What that means is this deck does tend to be weak to large amounts of removal and board wipes. Selfless Savior does some work, but if they don't manage to keep either some kind of Voice of the Blessed effect that's growing or Scurry Oak that's growing on the board, then a lot of their deck is kind of just bad cards that rely on synergy. So it is a functional plan to just board into cheap removal that knocks out their key pieces. Rakdos Arcanist lists tend to come in one of two main flavors, one being versions with Lurrus, and the other being versions with 4-mana Planeswalkers. We're going to look at the Lurrus version first, which tends to focus more on Delirium with Dragon's Rage Channeler, and card advantage with Young Pyromancer, and turbo filling the graveyard with Stitcher Supplier to enable earlier Kroxas. They tend to have less scaling into the late game because they lack the more mid-range Planeswalkers, and try to make up for the difference with Lurrus. From there, they play kind of like a traditional Dreadhorde Arcanist list, playing lots of 1-mana interaction and hand hate, and trying to regain some card advantage by flashing all of that back with Dreadhorde Arcanist. This is one of the decks that is the most reliant on the graveyard of all the decks out there. If they can't flash back their Kroxa, if they can't get card advantage with Dreadhorde Arcanist, if they can't rebuy stuff with Lurrus, then pretty much all their deck is really weak 1-for-1s at best. So more than most decks, this tends to suffer from the tendency in Historic of lots of decks to 1, play sideboard graveyard hate, and 2, especially play main deck graveyard hate. It just so happens that a lot of decks that want to turn on Unholy Heat run Soul Guide Lantern to do that, and that is not a card that is fun to play against when you are playing a graveyard deck, especially in Game 1. Beyond that, it's worth noting that the primary interaction that this deck has against effects like Rest in Peace tend to be Feed the Swarm out of the sideboard, so something to be conscious of if you are playing a control deck. That's probably going to be something that if you manage to resolve a Rest in Peace, you'll want to consider counterspells to protect, but they can only answer it at sorcery speed. The larger version of Rakdos, on the other hand, which is identifiable pretty much at a glance because they're not going to be playing Lurrus, tends to not play some of the smaller card advantage cards or more aggressive cards. Usually no Young Pyromancer, no 1-drop that's milling them a bunch to turbo out Kroxa, and most of the time, no Dragon's Rage Channeler. These are not decks that, despite the low mana curve, actually want to be aggressive. They want to play efficient removal and kind of play more of a modern Jund style game where they strip both players of pretty much all the resources early on, remove what does get played, and then curve into the mid game with Seasoned Pyromancer, Sorin the Mirthless, and Chandra providing card advantage to eke out the win in a resource-light environment. They tend to be weak to decks that do powerful top-decking moves, similar to Sorin and Chandra. So if you have the opportunity to sideboard into hefty mid-range threats, which could be Planeswalkers, could be cards like Escape to the Wilds. Anything that has a really big immediate game impact, the second you top deck it, before your opponent has the chance to make you discard it. Those tend to be the kind of effects that are really powerful against this. Next up, Niv Mizzet Reborn decks have kind of gone through a metamorphosis recently, spurred on by the addition of the card Territorial Kavu. Territorial Kavu, in pretty much all situations by the time turn 3 rolls around with this deck, is a 2-mana 5/5. It buys them a bunch of time against aggro, and provides a way that the deck actually gets to pressure control decks that previously didn't exist. Older versions tried to play against control decks by being heavier on Hand Hate, Thoughtseizes, and Inquisition of Kozilek's, and then tried to use Drown in the Loch as a counterspell to push through a Niv Mizzet for a huge amount of card advantage that control couldn't deal with. Less the case now, though. Now they are usually heavier on removal, heavier on different card advantage options, and try to lean on Territorial Kavu as their main way to fight control matchups. Whereas previously these decks were really all about beating a Phoenix, and that's still the case, they do still beat Phoenix. They have a much better game plan overall against all kinds of small to medium range aggressive decks like Gruul. If you're looking to beat Niv Mizzet with a more controlling list, then the best advice I can give is remember to bring in your Aether Gusts. The main things that are going to inconvenience you, aside from your opponent managing to stick an unpleasant Teferi or resolve something with Dovin's Veto backup, is that you're going to be pressured by Territorial Kavu, Klothys, and Niv Mizzet. Aether Gust hits every single one of those. It's way more useful than you would expect against a deck that is supposed to be 5 colors. Jund Food is sort of in a strange spot in the metagame right now, and I'm including it for comprehensiveness, but admitting that I'm not entirely certain whether or not it's a good deck right now. So sort of similar to Green-Black, this is a deck that has historically preyed on creature decks, but Trail of Crumbs, Cauldron Familiar, and Witch's Oven tend to provide a long-term source of card advantage and inconvenient to deal with permanence that allows it to have a lot of game against control too. And then when your opponent does eventually have to tap out for a board wipe or something, the goal is to slam a Corvold and draw so many cards that control is massively behind on resources. The problem there is that it's unclear if that's still the case against the blue-white control decks that are running Divine Purge. For similar reasons as to why Green-Black could have a hard time, it's kind of tough to rely on Witch's Oven and Cauldron Familiar to get through Divine Purge once they start costing 3 mana to replay. That is card advantage, but it's a lot of time. And Trail of Crumbs in particular, although it doesn't seem at first directly affected by Divine Purge, loses all of the food tokens that are in play, so if you don't have ways to sacrifice them quickly, the way games tend to curve out can be awkward. But on the whole of things, this is still a pretty powerful deck that has potent options against everything, and I don't think is ever necessarily bad, but may not be as favored as it used to be in a lot of matchups. Jeskai, or sometimes Izzet Creativity, is one of the combo decks in the format that kind of bridges the gap between a control deck and a combo deck, and can be sort of tricky to identify what's going on because it can be built in a couple of different ways. Some versions run Dwarven Mine as a way to get creatures into play with no resource investment that they are then able to sacrifice to Indomitable Creativity to get out some big creature combo. But that requires playing a lot of mountains. Some versions don't go that route and instead try to play Archmage's Charm to have more of a traditional control game where they can play counter spells and removal spells at instant speed and try to only use the combo as a finisher instead of necessarily the all-in part of the game plan. Some versions go so deep as to play Pact of Negation to be able to resolve their combo through Disruption, and even the combo itself tends to be something that varies from deck to deck, or even from main deck to sideboard. Generally speaking, Indomitable Creativity targets roughly 2 permanents on their board, some sort of tokens, be it treasure tokens or creature tokens off of hard evidence, and then turns them into either a bunch of Serra's emissaries that then start naming card types that the player has protection from, and permanents have protection from there on out. So 2 Serra's emissaries will traditionally name creatures to stop your opponent from killing your stuff, and then maybe instant to stop you from being able to remove the Serra's emissaries. And a lot of decks just get immediately locked out from that and then die to 2 7/7 angels rather quickly. But some things like Wrath of God that ignore protection, or effects like Stomp or Questing Beast that make it so that damage can't be prevented, mean that your opponent having protection from creatures doesn't actually stop damage, and you can still try to squeeze through the last couple of lethal points of damage through 2 7/7 blockers. Or wait until the 2 Serra's emissaries have attacked, and then try to push through for lethal with more of the onboard creatures. The alternate combo that they go for, if that doesn't seem like the way they want to build their deck, is to play Locust God and Sage the Falls. The general idea here being that if both of these creatures get into play and then aren't removed, Sage the Falls makes a trigger to draw a card and then discard a card, but they don't care, every time that a creature enters the battlefield under their control, and Locust God makes a 1/1 flyer with haste every time they draw a card. Because Locust God is entering at the same time as Sage of the Falls, they get a couple of triggers to draw cards, which draw more cards, which draw more cards, and eventually end up with enough hasty 1/1 flyers to attack for lethal, because the combo is optional and they get to choose to stop before they deck themselves. They additionally have a couple of different ways they can take things in the sideboard. In controlling matchups, they can try to be more controlling by boarding into Hullbreaker Horror or Nezahal the Primal Tide. Hullbreaker Horror is a little less common now that it isn't uncounterable, but Nezahal tends to still be somewhat popular against the blue-white and Jeskai Control decks that are relatively traditional. It's uncounterable, hard to answer, and draws a bunch of cards, and then doesn't die because they can discard a bunch of cards to exile it and bring it back. Of note, though, they tend to have fewer viable game plans post-board against the Lotus Field decks, because Nezahal has a return to battlefield trigger when it comes back after you discard the cards that is stifleable, and they have no way to protect that short of just hoping they have enough counter spells in hand and enough mana to use them. And if that trigger gets stifled, they discarded 3 cards and their Nezahal never comes back. So they also can occasionally try to board into plans where they just play Chandra Awakened Inferno or Commence the Endgame, although that's vulnerable to Archmage's Charm stealing the tokens, and try to play a more fair game plan post-board, but they aren't starting from a place where they have as many good cards, so when they fall back to that plan, it usually doesn't wind up with them being favored, it just winds up with them being less unfavored. Also worth noting, this deck has a lot of different ways the mana base can be built, as mentioned earlier with regards to the Archmage's Charm or the Rorvamine. There are some versions that just don't even play white at all, so if you do see one with white, be aware that Dovin's Veto and Rest in Peace tend to be sideboard cards that those play, but not always. Blue-white auras represents the last of what I would consider the most major decks in the historic format, with the ones to follow being slightly more fringe, but might be a pretty strong pick for the most likely deck to go well this weekend. It has a pretty good matchup against the majority of the control decks in the format, as well as a pretty good matchup against most of the aggro decks. It's overall in a pretty decent spot right now. Historically, its weaknesses have been decks that play a lot of effective low-cost removal, and those decks aren't as common right now, with more decks trying to orient themselves to beat control decks. Whether the control decks can actually be good against blue-white auras, I don't know. A lot of the Lotus Field builds and a lot of the straight blue-white builds have weaker removal suites, Divine Purge might be a decent card against blue-white in the long run, but in order to run that, you need to not run some of your most effective 1-mana removal, and decks tend to live and die against auras based on the cost-effectiveness of their 1 and 2 mana removal that is ideally instant speed. So the general idea behind this deck is that you play SRAM Senior Edificer and Core Spirit Dancer as ways to draw cards every single time you play an aura, and then you get to round those out with either really resilient cards like Adanto Vanguard, or cards that allow you to draw even more cards like Stormchaser Drake, followed up by more things that wear auras well or protect your card drawy spells like Esper Sentinel and Selfless Savior. From there, the deck mostly just plays lots of different random enchantments that pump their creatures, draw cards, Curious Obsession and Staggering Insight tending to be foremost among those that produce card advantage over the long term, and then lots of disruption and protection. Notably, Karametra's Blessing that gives a enchanted creature indestructible and hexproof, and Spell Pierce are the two very major protection spells from this deck that you need to be aware of. That's what you, anytime you're thinking about what kind of interaction your opponent could have and what way to play around it, those are the two defining cards, aside from an onboard Selfless Savior, that should inform your decision-making process. And choosing which of those to play around in any given position can be kind of tricky. It's worth noting this isn't a hard and fast rule, but Spell Pierce tends to be more common in the lists, usually closer to a 4 of, while the Karametra's Blessings tend to be slightly closer to a 2 of. But any individual opponent you play against may change that up, but I would lean towards expecting your opponent to have Spell Pierce more often than Karametra's Blessing as a result. Out of the sideboard, they tend to go into different either answers to creatures, in the case of the Mirror, or resilient cards like Cerulean Drake and Apostle Purifying Light, when they need creatures that are slightly harder to answer. But also worth noting that they typically have access to Containment Priest if you are trying to play some kind of Indomitable Creativity combo deck, so maybe try not to go off until you have a removal spell for Containment Priest unless you really can't avoid it. White-Black Auras, on the other hand, hasn't been as popular lately. It tends to be better than Blue-White against decks that are packing a lot of removal, especially creature decks that play a lot of like Mayhem Devil style removal, because it has more resilience with its creatures in the form of Kaya's Ghost Form, Demonic Vigor, and Claim to Fame, in addition to Agadeem's Awakening. It also plays more proactive answers as opposed to counterspells in the form of Thoughtseize and Duresses, and has a little more removal that it gets to recur with Lurrus while getting card advantage, because it gets to play Mogus's Favor, Deadweight, and sometimes Mire's Grasp out of the sideboard. Otherwise, most of the game plan is the same, but no counter magic, and a little less card draw because it doesn't have the blue auras that draw cards whenever it attacks. That tends to mean that its ultimate spot is a little weaker against the control decks that pack a lot of removal-based exile and a lot of instant speed exile, or instant speed removal at all, which is sort of where the metagame is at, with the control decks kind of defining the pace of the format more or less right now, and White-Black Auras has tended to be a little less popular as a result. Enchantress is one of the most rogue decks in the metagame right now. It's doing something kind of unique in a way not a lot of other decks are super prepared to deal with. So if you've seen a lot of really random Cleansing Novas or Rampage of the Clans in the sideboard, know that it's because decks are annoyed at losing to this and want to have a plan against it. Basically, the deck is entirely an Enchantress-themed deck that plays around enchantments, drawing cards, and assembling ultimately the 9 lives Solemnity combo. Sometimes they play Umori, sometimes they don't. It usually depends on whether or not they care about the sideboard space, for 1, because it's kind of slow, or 2, want to play Grafdigger's Cage in the main deck or not. But generally speaking, this deck tries to assemble a combo where Solemnity stops 9 lives from getting counters, and 9 lives says that anytime they would take damage, instead 9 lives gets a counter, and when 9 lives gets 9 counters, it gets exiled, and when 9 lives leaves the battlefield, they lose the game. But if it's not getting counters because of Solemnity, then it's just preventing damage forever. Other common ways to try to interrupt this combo include Bonecrusher Giant, casting Stomp, or Questing Beast. It just, somewhere on it has a line of text saying damage can't be prevented. I promise it's on there. You just need to read it a couple of times, and like by the second or third time it'll show up. Aside from that, the deck tries to basically make that reliable by playing Enchantress's Presence and Sithis Harvest's Hand to draw a bunch of cards every time they cast an enchantment, which is most of their deck. By playing things like Authority of the Consuls to make sure that their opponent's creatures are a little slower and that they get to gain life each time something comes in. Paladin class to make it harder to counter their stuff. And then the big accelerant is Sanctum Weaver, that is a 2-drop mana dork that by the time turn 3 or 4 rolls around might be tapping for like 5, 6, 7 mana a pop. From there, they can actually finish the game with Destiny Spinner that activates for 4 mana to turn a land into a XX creature with Trample and Haste, where X is the number of enchantments they control, together with Sanctum Weaver that can mean potentially animating 2 or 3 lands as 8/8s or more. Worth noting, Destiny Spinner does not untap the lands that it activates to target, so if you are trying to figure out if your opponent potentially has lethal or whether they're able to block on a specific turn by Destiny Spinnering up a land, it takes 5 untapped mana to make a blocker. I've definitely missed that in the past. Goblins is another deck that kind of had its heyday and sort of faded away with the advent of decks playing a lot of counterspells. They are essentially a tribal deck that attempts to get out Muxus to put a ton of goblins into play all at once, and then hope Goblin War Chief and Goblin Chieftain give everything haste to attack for just a totally ludicrous amount of damage. Their fallback plans when that doesn't succeed tend to be either to try to be very aggressive and just swarm an opponent and kill them with kind of a traditional Goblins game plan, or to do the polar opposite and be super resource intense. The way they tend to do that is with Goblin Ringleader, Herald's Horn, and Conspicuous Snoop, just providing an absolute massive card advantage to the extent that it doesn't matter whether a Muxus resolves or not, they just have too many things for you to answer. They tend to be kind of unhappy if you board wipe them, and tend to be very unhappy if control decks actually have answers to Herald's Horn and counterspells for Ringleader. Some of the newer tech that they have gotten recently that didn't exist previously are the cards Munitions Expert and Sling Gang Lieutenant that give them more reach when the battlefield gets clogged up. Previously, they could get kind of invalidated by a 4/4. That's less the case now, and it does make it harder for control to stabilize at a low life total and be safe. Additionally, a combo that has shown up somewhat recently that can help them gain an edge in mid-range mirrors, and is something to be aware of if you ever see them playing Black Mana or Goblin Chain Whirler especially, is that Call of the Death Dweller gets back a 3-drop and then puts a Death Touch counter on that 3-drop, or can just be used to get back like a Conspicuous Snoop and a Skirk Prospector if they're looking for card advantage. But notably, Goblin Chain Whirler, when it gets its Death Touch, is a one-sided Plague Wind that breaks a lot of mid-range mirrors very quickly. Additionally, they tend to have Roiling Vortex and Bonecrusher Giant, as do most red aggressive decks right now. Roiling Vortex being a way that they can interact with the Heliod combo. Rampaging Ferocity, also another common one that didn't make it in here on this list. And then Bonecrusher Giant for the Enchantress matchup, where they need to be able to get through a 9 lives. Gruul Aggro is probably the most successful of the current examples of an archetypical aggro deck right now. It tends to just try to do pretty normal beatdown things, curving out Llanowar Elves into hasty 3-drops, or Pelt Collector into lots of 2-drops, Burning Tree Emissary being one of the more common cards to every list, trying to get a really explosive start where they get to just put a absolute huge number of things into play on turn 2. But beyond that, the general game plan is they play lots of threats and try to have as many threats as possible have haste. Collected Company and Embercleave tend to be the top ends to be worried about, so if you see your opponent leaving up a lot of mana and not playing something at sorcery speed, probably one of those 2 cards. And then they run the usual gambit of aggressive answers to the Heliod Company decks and the Enchantress decks in the form of Questing Beast and Bone Crusher to stop damage prevention, and Rampaging Frostodon to stop life gain. And again, the damage prevention also being useful against the Indomitable Creativity decks that try to put angels and give everything protection from creatures. Shamans is one of the lists that is definitely doing more of its own thing and might be pretty unfamiliar to folks who haven't played Historic recently, because it's very much hinged around the card Harmonic Prodigy that was only added recently. Basically, they play a bunch of different cards that are either Shamans or Wizards, most of them Shamans, and start doubling up the triggers. That means things like Elvish Visionary drawing 2 cards, Burning Tree Emissary making 4 mana, and most of all, Rage Forger putting 2 counters on every Shaman when it enters the battlefield, and dealing 2 damage whenever any creature with a +1/+1 counter attacks. They tend to have some pretty busted starts if they manage to curve a couple of Burning Tree Emissaries into a Harmonic Prodigy and then a turn 3 Rage Forger. So more so than most decks, you're gonna want to know what this deck is doing, because Harmonic Prodigy can look like a pretty innocent card, but taking it out is very important. Another really important thing to note when playing against this deck, they tend to board into Goblin Ruin Blasters, which are usually fine cards, but start blowing up 2 lands at a time if a Harmonic Prodigy is in play. Sometimes that's something they main deck, but otherwise, think of this sort of as a Gruul Aggro list that can try to do late game Klothys, Chandra plans, but for the most part is much more all out of the gate trying to explode into something. So if you have answers to Rage Forger, you can try to let them develop their board more and then get some massive card advantage with a board wipe. But beware if your plan is to try to do something like Anger of the Gods, because Rage Forger tends to take their boards out of range of that very quickly. And be aware that if you're trying to race them, leaving their creatures on the board like Anarchomancer or Harmonic Prodigy can lead to some really explosive, huge amounts of mana on the following turn. So it might be more beneficial than you'd expect to clear their board rather than develop yours. Blue-White Affinity is another one of those decks that's kind of doing its own thing and really rewards you for understanding how it's functioning. As the name would suggest, it cares about the artifact count on board quite a bit. The main payoffs for that are Thought Monitor, Reverse Engineer, Metallic Rebuke, and Nettle Cyst. Metallic Rebuke in particular is worth noting. It's a counter spell that allows you to tap artifacts to pay for the generic mana cost, which means that a lot of the time with this deck having a bunch of artifacts like Portable Hole, Black Staff, Grafdigger's Cage sitting around that it doesn't really have a use for ever tapping, it has 1 mana counter target spell unless you pay 3 up a lot of the time, and that's something you're going to want to spend a lot of time playing around or potentially playing into, because playing around it every single turn is painful, and sometimes the best way to rip off the Band-Aid is to rip off the Band-Aid and get something countered. Beyond that, Reverse Engineer and Thought Monitor give them very effective ways to draw lots of cards, and Nettle Cyst does a very good job of turning every card in their deck into a threat, including the random Ornithopters or tiny Stonecoil Serpents or tiny Esper Sentinels that otherwise you could ignore. If you haven't played Modern before, what this card does is creates a Germ token and attaches to it when it enters the battlefield, and then gives the creature +1/+1 for each artifact they control. Counting Nettle Cyst, that's at least 1. And then usually they get something really, really giant that you're going to have to spend a lot of time chump blocking, and when you do eventually find an answer to it, they're going to move the Nettle Cyst on to the next thing. One very important thing to note when you're playing against this deck is the card Treasure Vault. Anytime you're doing math for Metallic Rebuke or Thought Monitor or mostly Nettle Cyst, bear in mind that this is something they can play for 0 mana that will pump the number of artifacts they have, and the activated ability represents the possibility to pump Nettle Cyst at instant speed by sacking the Treasure Vault and losing 1 artifact, but once they have 6 or more mana, generating multiple treasures. So think of that as a combat trick, play around it when you see it on board. Mono Red Madness is another one of those kind of linear decks that's doing something not entirely related to the graveyard in a way that gets around a lot of the main deck graveyard hate. Essentially, it plays a lot like some of the more aggressive mono red decks you might have seen in the past, but playing cards like Blazing Rootwalla, Fiery Temper, Ox of Agonis, and Managorger Phoenix especially takes more advantage of discarding cards than more traditional mono red burn lists. Managorger Phoenix in particular is one to take note of because it's got a lot of text. Basically, kind of similar to Arclight Phoenix, it sits in the yard for a while, and as they cast spells, it gets counters on it. And then eventually, after they've cast enough spells, which is related to the number of red sources in the spell's mana costs, it comes back and perpetually gets bigger. And because of the way Perpetual works, when you kill it, the next time they do that, as it sits in the graveyard, it also comes back again, but this time it's even bigger as a 4/4, etc., etc. But basically, the traditional mono-red game plan is still here. Attack with stuff early, try to get your opponent's life total down, finish them with burn spells like Ramunap Ruin. The main difference being that these decks do actually play more dirtily cards than a mono-red deck that you'd be familiar with. Unholy Heat, not going face, just being a removal spell for creatures. Faithless Looting being kind of just raw card disadvantage most of the time, unless you're discarding stuff like Blazing Rootwalla that get to come back, or Fiery Temper. Ox of Agonis being just a really chonky creature that they don't play until the late game. These decks are not about playing hasty threats early and trying to get every point of damage as soon as possible. They have a real ability to scale into the late game, so don't throw away resources as quickly as you might against a mono red list. You do still need to care about your life total. They are still going to pressure you, but you actually have to win the late game too. That's not going to be a freebie. Merfolk is similar to blue-white auras in that it's a aggressive deck that tries to be disruptive in a way that buys it a lot of space against the various different control decks out there. Essentially, the plan is that they play a lot of somewhat effective early attacking creatures that tend to have 2 power, a lot of lords that pump them up, and then try to kill the opponent while relying on disruptive cards like Spell Pierce and Miscast to deny removal and board wipes. Additionally, they get to play some kind of funky effects like Marrow Regery that can remove blockers against aggressive decks. Same story as Merfolk Trickster. Svelun that gives all of the other Merfolk some sort of slightly more expensive to attack nonsense, and it can draw cards. And Collected Company to represent instant speed card advantage when they're not playing counter spells. They're fairly linear in the sense that they are about attacking and beating down, and the only thing that changes that is when they need to be disruptive against creatures versus other aggro decks, versus when they need to be disruptive against board wipes out of the control decks. Most of the sideboard options that they tend to play are either about invalidating removal spells or answering artifacts and enchantments, because they do tend to have slightly fewer ways to go around the various different combo decks lockouts. Mono Black Aggro is one of the less common decks in the format, but did recently win the Stream League last weekend, so it wouldn't be strange to see some folks picking it up as a result of that. It tends to be one of the better aggressive options that you can pick into Jeskai Control, because a significant portion of its strength is having cards that are kind of resilient to the removal packages they play, in the form of Graveyard Trespasser, Rotting Registrar, and Phyrexian Obliterator, that just don't die as easily to damage. But it can be a little weaker against the blue-white control decks because it doesn't have great answers to Divine Purge and actual factual Wrath of Gods. But otherwise, it tends to play pretty linearly like an aggressive deck. It doesn't really have any fallback plans for card advantage other than Castle Locthwain. It typically doesn't board into anything. It just tries to kill the opponent real fast and hope that Sap Vitality and Murderous Rider are enough removal spells to create openings to attack. Worth noting that the answer that they play against the Heliod combo decks is Blight Beetle, which stops Scurry Oak from getting counters put on it, and the answers to the enchantment decks are Feed the Swarm and Lost Legacy to try to deny the 9 lives combo from coming down in the first place. Selesnya Humans is a deck that fell out of favor after the last set championship because Luminarch Aspirant got nerfed, and it kind of got trounced at the event by Green-Black Food, but it might not be a terrible pick for this weekend. It is a deck that is fairly resilient to the removal spells out of the different control decks. They have a lot of stuff that makes board wipes more expensive, and cards like Hamlet Vanguard are very resilient to a lot of different types of removal right now, and Collected Company kind of embarrasses sorcery speed board wipes. But they just have kind of an insurmountable weakness against decks that are running Cauldron Familiars and Meathook Massacres. But as those decks have kind of fallen out of favor because the decks they have preyed on sort of to extinction, there might be a spot for this deck to come back. Beyond that, there are a lot of cards here that are not always main decked. This, more than most, kind of has a toolboxy element to the cards that it gets to play. And I would generally expect, if you are trying to play against this deck, the thing you should most be aware of the majority of the time is Adeline and what your plan to deal with it is. It ends games very fast, and trying to make sure you don't use removal on Adeline, which might be your only removal for Adeline, on stuff earlier in the game, can make or break whether you manage to beat this deck or not as a control deck. Mono Green Ramp is another one of the kind of out there decks doing something pretty different from the rest of the format that you aren't likely to see a ton of, but that has been picking up in popularity recently. Generally, the idea of the deck is that it is a ramp deck with a whole lot of ability to use Settle the Wilds as a sort of tutor spell. They play a lot of expensive one-ofs that are fetchable with Settle the Wilds with proper management of the number of lands in play, and there are a lot of different combo decks and control decks that don't really handle Ugins and Ulamogs well in the late game, and don't handle Nissa well in the mid game. The general idea of the deck is to just pretty linearly ramp into those finishers. It does not have a ton of removal early. It tends to live and die by whether it finds one of these finishers in time. So, of note, if you're playing against this, bear in mind which of the finishers listed here is something that you're particularly concerned about, and try to play around saving your removal for which ones are important, or don't overextend into potentially an Ugin if you don't have to. More than most decks out there, this one really rewards you for understanding how your sequencing lines up against the cards that they are probably about to fetch, especially when you know what your opponent just got with Settle the Wilds. Well, you don't actually know what they got, but knowing what they could have gotten because of the exact CMC they got is important. So, a quick overview of Settle the Wilds. 3-mana spell that puts a land into play and then grabs a random permanent card from the library with mana value equal to the number of lands that were in play after Settle the Wilds put a land into play. So if your opponent has 4 lands and casts Settle the Wilds, they're going to get a 5-drop. Bear that in mind to make sure you don't try to play around the wrong CMC of card. And wrapping things up with the common decks in the format is Elves. This is probably one of the more familiar decks to a lot of folks from a lot of different formats. The general idea is that it tries to play as many elves as possible, most of which make a large amount of mana in the form of Llanowar Elves, Elvish Archdruid, Circle of Dreams Druid, and then just ramp out a very wide board with that intense mana advantage, and either use something like Allosaurus Shepherd or Archdruid's Anthem effect to get tall enough, wide enough that they can swing for lethal, or play a Craterhoof Behemoth and make everything absolutely huge. They tend to be pretty weak to board wipes and don't have a ton of long-term recovery options other than the card's advantage they can get from the creatures on the board. So more so than a lot of other decks, it's pretty linear and tends to get hurt by removal. It's not as popular as a lot of the other linear decks right now because it doesn't necessarily interact at all with any of the combo decks and can get raced. But if you're trying to play a fair aggro deck like, say, Gruul, they can tend to outgrow your ability to actually attack into them unless you have a very good curve of aggressive creatures. Additionally, it's worth noting that, at least compared to most decks' sideboards, Elves tends to be totally mono-green in the main deck, and then have access to all kinds of different colors to give it outs to various different combo decks in the format. So in Game 1 especially, if you are playing a combo deck, or a control deck of any kind, really, pay attention to if your opponent's playing any non-basic lands, especially Pathways tend to be the most common card these decks use to splash. If you see white, then bear in mind that your opponent could board into Declaration in Stone or Rest in Peace if you're a graveyard deck, and if you see blue, your opponent is probably going to be considering playing Aether Gusts or Negates. So, in closing, I hope you found that helpful and informative. If you have a deck you want to play, or if you have questions about what deck you should play, feel free to hit me up in the comments. I'm interested in seeing what kind of decks people are considering, and if you have questions about what some of the decks you saw look like in more detail, or how a specific deck you want to play should be boarding against some of these decks, yeah, let me know. I'm always happy to chat about that. So, with that said, hope y'all have a wonderful day.